Hi, I'm Judith Dreyer. Thank you for joining me for this podcast series, The Holistic Nature of Us. My intent is to take us, you and I, into a better understanding of the concepts behind our holistic nature and how that ties directly to the holistic nature of the world around us. How can we connect the dots in practical ways that we are nature and nature is in us? I will be featuring authors and educators, practitioners, and others whose passion for this earth helps us create bridges. We'll see what's trending, what's relevant to our world today, not just for land use, but to connect the dots between nature and ourselves. It's time for practical action and profound inner change so our natural world is valued once again. Today, I'm delighted to introduce you to Doug Tallamy. He's the author of Bringing Nature Home. Good morning, Doug. How are you today?
I'm fine. How are you?
Good. It's great to have you here. I would love you to start off with telling us about your credentials and how you got into writing the book, Bringing Nature Home, and why it's so relevant today.
All right. I'm a professor at the University of Delaware, the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology. I am an entomologist, and I've been there 37 years, so I guess age alone gives me a little bit of credentials. I've been keeping my eyes open, looking at what's happening around me for most of my life. I would call myself a behavioral ecologist, and one of the things that I have focused on is how insects interact with plants. When you combine plants and insects, you're talking about the most numerous organisms on the planet. So how they interact with each other really determines what life is like on planet Earth. I wrote Bringing Nature Home more or less accidentally. We moved into a new house we built on 10 acres in Oxford, Pennsylvania back in 2000. And the 10 acres were totally choked with non-native plants, invasive species, largely from China, autumn olive and oriental bittersweet and Japanese honeysuckle and multiflora rose and all those plants we're so familiar with. And one of the things I noticed right away, since I am an entomologist, I'm always looking for insects, was that there were very few insects on these plants. They weren't able to use them. Well, this was not news to me, because one of the things we studied way back in graduate school in the 70s was that most insects are specialists. They can only use the plants with which they have a co-evolved relationship. And that's because plants protect themselves chemically from insect use. So insects adapt to particular lineages of plants and get around those particular defenses. But in specializing on particular lineages of plants, they are not specializing on any other lineages. So I always use the monarch butterfly as a good example. It's a specialist on milkweeds, and it can detoxify the cardiac glycosides in milkweeds, and it can behaviorally avoid the sticky latex sap. So it can eat a plant that is unavailable to most other insects. But in developing all those adaptations, it has not spent any evolutionary time developing ways of getting around the tannins that are in oaks, or the cucurbitacins and cucurbits, or the nicotine in tobacco, and on and on and on. And the downside of this specialization, I mean, the upside is that insects get to eat plants. The downside is that they can only eat particular plants. So if we take away, for example, if we take away milkweeds, we've lost the monarch. It can't just start to eat oaks or grass or something else. And that is essentially what led me to the rather alarming conclusion when I looked around and saw that so many of the plants in my yard and all around us are not from here anymore. They're largely from Asia, and some of you farther south, they're from South America. So here we have plants from another continent that have not been here long enough for our insects to develop those specialized relationships. And that means we're losing those insects.
And that has consequences, right, up the food chain?
Right. That's what we've spent the last 10 years researching in my lab. And people wanted to read about that research, so they said, could you write something? And I said, well, I'll write a pamphlet. And the pamphlet became Bringing Nature Home. But what we've learned is that insects, as Ed Wilson says, insects are the little things that run the world. And if you take them away, the world will not run anymore. So they're not just components of our ecosystems; they're essential components of our ecosystems. Now, I have focused on their role in supplying the energy for food webs. So what happens when you put plants in the landscape that don't create insects? Well, then you lose your birds, because the birds require those insects to reproduce. And I'll just give you a quick example. Chickadees. I always use chickadees. Just a tiny little bird, a third of an ounce. But when they're rearing their young, it takes 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to make one clutch of chickadees. So if your yard is loaded with plants that don't make those caterpillars, then you have no chickadees. And if we do that all over the U.S., then we lose our birds. We lose all of the things that eat insects, which it turns out is most of the animal life that is out there. So this is a huge problem. We cannot afford to gut our ecosystems of the plants and animals that actually run them. And the reason we can't lose biodiversity and remain happy on this planet is that it is the plants and animals around us that run the ecosystems that support us. It's ecosystems that produce what we call ecosystem services.
I like that. Yeah.
There are our life support systems. Our life support system is not Walmart, and it's not Starbucks. It all comes from healthy ecosystems. And if they collapse, which they are in various places of the planet, we humans are going to be in big trouble. So another thing E.O. Wilson says is if we lose our insects, we will lose the flowering plants. That's 90% of our flowering plants depend on insects for pollination, which means our food webs will collapse. So we'll lose our mammals, our reptiles, our amphibians, our birds, and that includes humans. And the scary thing is that people are starting to measure insect declines around the world. You might have seen recently in the New York Times some studies out of Germany that have been looking at insect populations for the last, I think it's 30 years, since the 80s. And they're showing 80% declines in flying insects in that 30 years.
Wow.
Well, if these are the little things that run the world, that's bad news. That's bad news. We can't afford to lose them.
We can't. And it seems like Europe, for some reason, I know when I was studying the bee issue, and I was actually somewhat appalled to read that they already knew about the decline in bees, the honeybees, with systemic pesticides in Europe at least 10 years before it hit our airwaves, and they were already taking action on that particular issue. It seems like we're just so slow to respond, to this urgency. I feel a sense of urgency here.
Yes. I ran into a quote yesterday, again by E.O. Wilson. It says, conservation biology is a discipline with a deadline. Mm-hmm. Because when it's gone, it's gone. You can't conserve it at that point. It is disappearing. And this brings me to what I talk about all over the U.S. these days, and that is the role that private property owners need to play in this. When you look at the amount of land that is privately owned in the U.S., it's most of it. In the lower 48, 83% of the U.S. is privately owned, and east of the Mississippi, 85% is privately owned. So if we only worry about conservation on our public properties and our parks and preserves, we're going to lose it. That's not nearly enough space. We have to practice conservation at home. I talk about doing, I guess it's 4 vital things. We have to design landscapes that support food webs, so we have to have other living things around us. We have to design landscapes that sequester carbon. Most of our landscapes have just a fraction of the plants that they could have in them because we have these giant lawns and we've taken out most of the trees. Well, those plants are all built of carbon, and when we take them away, it's up in the atmosphere. And we've been cutting down the forests on this planet for the last 10,000 years. So all that carbon is up in the atmosphere now, and it's about a third of the carbon that's up there. So we could pull a good deal of it out by putting plants back wherever we can. And then those plants, in turn, pump carbon into our soils. Our soils can hold 7 times the amount of carbon that's in the atmosphere. So that's, we wonder what the solution to climate change is. It's getting the carbon back in the soil, and it's plants that do that. And then, of course, our plants, our landscapes also have to manage our watersheds. And again, it's plants that do that. The worst way to manage a watershed is a big lawn. That actually destroys your watershed. And then finally, we have to support our pollinators. We don't have enough natural areas to support the number and diversity of pollinators we need that are out there. So we now have to do that at home. And that gives each property owner a very crucial role in conservation. If everybody, don't look at the big picture, that can be depressing. But if you just look at preserving life on the little piece of property that you own, and if everybody did that, we'd be nearly done. So I see this as it's very doable, but it's going to take a collective effort, and it empowers each one of us. We now become an important part of the conservation puzzle, which, we have a lot of environmental issues, but it's hard for a single person to do something and see a change, see the results. But this is something where you can get positive feedback. You can see life come to your yard right away. You can see that chickadee successfully rear its young because you put the plants that made the caterpillars that it needed in your yard.
Well, these are. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, it's just it's a very rewarding exercise.
If we do it,
That's right.
What I'm finding with some of the garden clubs, for example, they're beautiful gardeners. However, many of them are over 60 in garden clubs because they have the time to do that, but they're not informed about sustainability. And they are the ones who love gardening. They're the ones who love digging in the dirt. But they have established yards, so it's a little more difficult for them in some ways to do major replantings. So I think it's almost like we have to hit a lower age group to get them to rethink about their suburban yards, the suburban town centers that go in. Where's the foliage? Where's the diversity in a lawn? And it may only be a 10 by 10 lawn, but there's nothing there except grass. We have to educate folks along those levels. What I loved about your talk too, the first one that I was able to get to, you mentioned how in 10 short years we can make a difference.
Yeah, even shorter than that. It's surprising how fast life will come back to your yard. Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit more about that giant lawn that everybody has. We have an area the size of New England in lawn at this point. And of course, we listen to the commercials, and we put Scott's Turf Builder on there, which is loaded with pesticides, and most of that runs off into our waterways. And we mow it every week. It's a very environmentally unfriendly way to treat that landscape. So I'm not suggesting that we get rid of lawn. I'm suggesting we just let's start by cutting it in half. Only have it where you're actually going to walk and use your yard, and then put plants back in that other half. And I talk about if you do that, we could create what I call a new national park that'll be over 20 million acres in size. I call it homegrown national park because we're going to do it at home. But 20 million acres, if you add up most of the major parks in the U.S., it's still less than 20 million acres. So this will be the largest national park in the country, scattered all over the place, but very effective. And it can build biological corridors that connect the actual habitat fragments that we have out there, which is vital because when they're isolated, there's just a steady drain of species from those areas. So this is I think it's going to be an extremely powerful approach to conservation. And I'm not going to give up on the over 60 crowd because they do have the time to do this. They love gardening, and all they need is the message that plants are more than decorations. They've spent their life thinking plants are pretty and we're going to decorate with them, and they are, and we can, but they also they have function. They're essential components of our ecosystems, and we have to pay attention to that function and put the plants that are best suited for doing particular ecological roles back in our yards. And I have found that when people learn that, they get excited about it. They don't fight it. They say, that's great. And it gives them a new reason to garden. And they're out there working at it a lot more than the younger folks. The younger folks are rearing the kids and establishing their careers, and they're really not thinking much about gardening.
Except that they want the organic food.
Yes.
They want the organic food. But that's a good point, because let's put the workforce that we have available to use making these changes, and then that will filter down to all those that have busy lifestyles, like young families who are rearing the children. That's great. I like that. The Homegrown National Park. That's a great movement.
I hope so.
Yeah, I think it will be. So can we go back to talking about our insects in this suburban landscape and how valuable they are?
Sure. I talked about their role in maintaining food webs, but they also are decomposers. So they're the major organisms that are recycling nutrients that return nutrients into the soil so that plants can grow again. And if we were to lose those decomposers, the earth would essentially rot, because it would only be bacteria and fungi breaking down things, which is much slower. It would be this rotting mass. Pollination, again, is just critical. 80% of all of our plants and 90% of all of our flowering plants are pollinated by insects. So losing pollinators is not an option. And one thing that people think about is if they see bumblebees and honeybees on their plants, they're happy to say, okay, we've got our pollinators. But those are actually just a very few species of generalist bees. We have 4,000 species of native bees here, and many of them are specialists. They will only reproduce on particular plant genera, like goldenrod, for example. I think in New England, there's 12 species of native bees that will only reproduce on goldenrod pollen. So if you don't have goldenrod, you've lost those 12 species. There's another 11 species that only reproduce on native willow pollen, and another 8 species that only reproduce on asters. So we need a diversity of plants that address the needs of these specialist bees, or we lose dozens and dozens of species of bees, which we can't afford to do.
Well, I hear you. You've got some great statistics excuse me, about that. I don't think most of us understand that there's 4,000 pollinators alone that are very specific to certain plants. We're not really taught about that. We're taught about how important the honeybee is and how people are monitoring those populations, for example. But there's specialist bees that work on the squash plant and on the sunflower plant. And we're not really taught to look for them or to value them in a sense. So these kinds of statistics, I think, get the message home about how important our own backyard can be in maintaining, creating, and continuing, biodiversity.
Can I just make a comment about that term backyard?
Mm-hmm.
I'm fighting against that, because that eliminates the front yard, which cuts our conservation area in half. It also implies that what we're talking about is so ugly we have to hide it in the backyard, which is not true. The most powerful plant you can put in your yard is an oak tree. Oaks are beautiful plants. Put it in the front yard, and now you've got a real conservation powerhouse there. There are 557 species of caterpillars, or 557 species of bird food that use oaks in my area in the mid-Atlantic states. So a yard without an oak is a yard that's really lost a lot of its potential.
I agree with you. Unfortunately, where I live, I watched a new housing development going in, a large apartment complex, And that particular area was filled with oaks. I think they were mostly red oaks, and they raised a whole hillside, and I'm going to assume something like a couple hundred trees are gone. And they were all in the oak family, and that made me very sad that there was no awareness in our town planners for agreeing to this kind of development without respect to the value of diversity in the landscape.
If we put monetary value on what these trees are doing for us, so if we had dollars associated with their role in maintaining the watershed, with their role in sequestering carbon, with their role in supporting food webs, that would be a lot of money you're throwing away. And then people would value it. They'd say, okay, this patch of woods is way too valuable to cut down. It's not worth another apartment complex. We'll do that someplace where there are no trees. That's what we need to do is to recognize that these ecosystem services are not free. We've never paid for them in the past, but we have to start paying for them in the future. And if you're going to cut down those oaks, you've got to pay for it. It's going to cost you because we have to replace them someplace else. That'll change the way we think.
Yeah. Do you see that happening in the communities around you or with your university connections? I mean, are we getting that message?
Well, I'll tell you who's getting it. Costa Rica got it a while ago when they realized their number one industry was ecotourism. They changed the tax structure and paid property owners to reforest their land, which improved the watershed to the point where the coral reefs started to come back. All these things that support ecotourism and the birds that people come there to see. So they were down to about 40% forested, and they made these changes in the tax structure, and I think they're up around 50% at this point. It's working, in other words. People respond right away because it first of all, they make a little bit of money, and they also it's culturally acceptable now. You're not the odd guy to protect your tree, but everybody will understand, hey, that tree's worth something. And that it's an attitude change. I don't see us doing it in the U.S. yet, but I do see us heading in that direction.
Well, that's something. I guess it's going to happen, one talk at a time, planting a seed, and hopefully if we can get, with all the talks that you do, and get somebody in that audience to go back home and rethink their landscapes, front and back, we're doing something. I do think front yards have taken off a little bit, though, in the last few years. People have been fighting community ordinances and really planting some beautiful things in their front yard, food and flowers, and they're pretty. Yes, they have their, they bloom and then they wane, and then they're going to have weeds or they're going to have stems at the end of the season, but people are maintaining it, and they're lovely in some of the communities I've been following a little bit, online. So that kind of thing is happening.
Well, this is where knowledge is power. Inside those dead stems is where those native bees spend the winter. So when you cut them all down, you've just thrown away where those native bees were trying to spend the winter. So we have to find ways to keep it neat, keep it attractive, but keep it diverse and allow these other things to share our land with us.
So based on that, would you say, as a sort of as a garden tip, I usually leave all my goldenrod, Joe Pyeweed, all those kinds of stems, I leave them there through the whole winter. But when it comes to spring, do you recommend breaking them up, burning them, having a small burn in your yard? What is your recommendation?
That's a tough one. Mulching them or burning them certainly kills all the things that are within them. If you're trying to maintain a meadow, you do have to do that once in a while, or the woody plants come in and replace it. Mm-hmm. Ideally, for people that have sizable properties, you recommend that you burn or mow a third and a third and a third. So every year you're only treating a third of your meadow, and the other 2/3 go untreated. So you will lose the things that are in that third, but you'll also restore the meadow. And then the other 2/3 recolonize that disturbed patch each year. So any one space is only burned or mowed once every 3 years. Mm-hmm. But if you have a small garden and you've got these stems you want to neaten up, I suggest you cut them off. And yes, leave them all winter, because that's providing seeds for those sparrows and birds that spend the winter here all winter. But then cut them off at the base, right around now, the end of March. And rather than just burning them or throwing them away, maybe tie them up in a bundle and stand them up in that. This is where you could use the backyard, someplace where anything that's inside those stems can still survive and then emerge, because they really don't emerge probably till May. So when we kill them in April or March, they're still dead.
Okay. That's interesting, because I've people ask me that, because I took my suburban backyard and created a meadow. That's what my book is about, At the Garden's Gate. And I left all the stems, as I said, throughout the whole winter. But when it came time for spring, I wanted to pick some of them up. I didn't get 100% of them up, but I wanted to pick some of them up just to neaten up, the space. Sure. Because then there's the other side of the coin where gardeners will say, well, if you don't pick them up, you're harboring disease and you're harboring pests, and that's going to ruin your coming garden.
Well, I think we overblow that. Who was picking them up before we got here? Everything wasn't disease-filled and pest-filled. It all was in balance. So yes, it's true that everybody sees an insect and they say, well, it's a pest. But a lot of the things you're harboring are the things we're doing that on purpose. We want those to be around. One of the big things that is hard for people to accept is if you have these native plants and these insects come and start to eat them, they in turn will attract their natural enemies. You'll have all the little hymenoptera, the little wasps that parasitize those caterpillars. You'll have the birds that eat those caterpillars. So you're not automatically going to have a defoliated yard. You're going to have an ecosystem we call it in trophic balance. You're going to have the natural enemies that keep those herbivores in balance. So that's what we're striving for. Sometimes it's harder to achieve than other times, but yes, you're going to have some living things in there, and that's why you do leave that stuff.
Right. And then what we forget is the holistic nature of this. Let's just use the meadow, for example, is that there's a check and balance in there.
Exactly. That's what we're talking about.
Okay. All right. Well, before we close, I would love you to just perhaps reiterate 3 tips that our listeners can take away today that's practical.
Okay. Tip number 1 would be to consider cutting the area you have in lawn in half, and then fill in the other half with productive plants. This doesn't mean that you can't have an attractive crepe myrtle or something. But when you measure the native versus non-native plants in your yard, and it turns out to be 80% non-native, that's not an ecosystem in balance. So cut the area of lawn in half would be tip 1.
Okay.
Tip 2 is to consider supporting the local pollinators, and that means you want to put in the plants that support the most specialists, which would be goldenrod and willows and asters and sunflowers. Those are the top plants in our areas. And you also want to consider plants that are blooming throughout the season. So I don't mean a single plant, but you need a sequence of blooms from late April right through October. That way you will support a diversity of bees that have a different life cycle over the course of the entire season. That would be tip 2.
That's great.
Tip 3, most people don't own enough property to really zero in on a particular creature they might want to save. But let's say you want to help the monarch. Team up with some neighbors and help create a monarch migration corridor. Everybody knows monarchs need milkweeds, and they do when they're developing, but they also need to migrate all the way to Mexico, and that means they need fall blooming plants. not just in your yard, but all the way down to Mexico. So this is where social networking can help, and you meet people that are like-minded, and it makes your conservation effort much more effective.
Those are great. Those are very practical things that people can think about today and actually act on today, because here in New England, we're in April and it's time to get outside and look at our yards differently, consider the plants we want to purchase, find the native plant nurseries, or at least find your local gardens, supply centers that have anybody there that's knowledgeable on supporting our pollinators and our ecosystems today. So that's great. And Doug, before we sign off, I'd love you to include your contact information. You do have a book. You've got a couple of books out there. You've written in many different types of publications. So could you give our listeners that information?
You mean my email address?
Your email address,
Okay.
where they can find your books.
Right. You can find both Bringing Nature Home and The Living Landscape on Amazon, or if you're a group and you want to, and you're having a conference, you can order it directly from Timber Press at half price and then sell them at your own profit. A lot of people do that. My email address is dtallamy, that's DTALLAMY @udel.edu.
Great. Do you have anything else you'd like to leave us with?
Plant an oak.
Plant an oak. I love it. Well, I can't thank you enough for joining me and my listeners today. This has been great, and I, as I said to you before, I feel this discussion is so timely for all of us to have profound interchange with how we look at our outer landscape. So I'm going to sign off here. I hope all of you feel as inspired as I do by Doug's talk and his very practical advice. And again, I can't thank you enough for joining us today. So this is Judith Dreyer, author of At the Gardenscape book and blog. And for more information, go to my website, judithdreyer.com. There will also be a written transcript of this podcast available when it's released. And I like to end with a quote from Paul Hawken. He's an environmentalist and author who reminds us, sustainability, ensuring the future life on Earth, is an infinite game, the endless expression on behalf of all.